We're good? Okay. We're gonna give it a few minutes to let people join. Or maybe not a few minutes, that's a long time. We'll give it 1 minute. Let people join up. I prepared a PowerPoint. It's official. If you're wondering what the whistling is, our fireplace whistles like 24/7 and it never stops. Pretty rough during quarantine. Hope everyone's safe out there. So obviously, this lesson is going to be based for a grade 8 classroom, and however, it's open to the public. It's open to all of the different people who are interested in having a lesson. So today's lesson is going to be on making Canada legal. And so what I'm going to be talking about is, from the grade 8 curriculum standpoint, how Canada has manufactured, created its existence, and how it currently maintains that existence through law. And so, first of all, we'll discuss what it means to be legal, what it means to be illegal. And a lot of the times people can confuse those things with what's good or what's bad. And unfortunately, in our society, that's not exactly how it works. Because a lot of negative or bad things that had happened in this country were in fact legal. And a lot of positive things, for an example, Indigenous ceremonies were at one point illegal in this country. So that's just one thing that I want to get out of the way very quickly, is that the difference between what is legal and illegal, it is not determinative of whether or not it's good or bad. So my name is André Bear. You can call me Mr. Bear. I have a Bachelor of Education degree with the Indian Teacher Education Program. I graduated last year, but I got into law school, and I now pursue my JD and my Master's of Business Administration in a combined degree. So today I'm humbled to be asked to teach a lesson, and I prepared this lesson on 8th grade social studies. And I pulled some of the outcomes straight out of the curriculum that I wanted to show you. So as a teacher, one of your main concerns is relating everything that you do in your classroom back to the Saskatchewan curriculum outcomes. And so I chose these 3 outcomes, DR 8.1, DR 8.2, and DR 8.3. And what this means is that as long as you are connecting your lessons and anything you're teaching in a classroom in Saskatchewan, they need to be somehow connected to sharing these outcomes with your students. So the first outcome is develop an understanding of the significance of land and the evolution of Canadian identity. So after this lesson, I'd like some feedback on whether or not you think I've hit all 3 of these outcomes. The second outcome will be describe the influence of the treaty relationship on Canadian identity. Number 3, assess how historical events in Canada have affected the present Canadian identity. So there is no stringent rules on how teachers will communicate this information to their students. I think that it's most important that teachers have their own sense of identity to be able to share these things from a personal perspective, and to do their own research in these areas to come up with valuable information that can be useful for their students. So one thing that I'll mention is that as Indigenous educators is that we need to both abide by the Saskatchewan curriculum outcomes, but at the same time we need to stay true to our inherent identity. We need to be able to operate from our own Indigenous identity where we are sharing oral history, where we are sharing our traditional education systems in order to teach, because that is what's most important to us as Indigenous peoples, is being able to be proud of who we are, to share who we are, and to revitalize and resurge our people and our nations. And so that's why the next thing I want to talk about is Indigenous legal orders. For me, this comes before the Saskatchewan curriculum guidelines. This is more important, this is more vital, and this is what's going to create healthy young students. And so what this means is that before you are thinking about the Saskatchewan curriculum guidelines and how to connect those to the students, we need to keep in mind our inherent identity, our Indigenous legal orders. And what that means is that we need to be able to look back to who we are as Indigenous people, to look back on how we live on the land, how we operate with our language, our culture, our education systems, our healthcare, and we need to recognize those things. And so here we have a picture of a young man, and he's smoking a pipe. In Cree, we call pipe oshwagan. Oshwagan. And so that's what we refer to as a pipe. And that's one of our most sacred objects as Indigenous people. And so when we talk about legal orders and we identify the importance of the pipe, we usually go straight to treaty. We go to the commitment and the covenant of what it means when you're using a pipe and you're building a relationship. The best way that I can explain that kind of commitment and that kind of relationship is marriage. So today we see a lot of people in Canada or anywhere who get married and they're often divorced not long after. And so that will happen quite often in our society. However, if you were to ever get married with a pipe through our Indigenous legal orders, there's never ever getting divorced. There's no divorce. You guys are stuck together like this forever in this world and in the spirit world. So those are that's one good way of looking at it, how important and vital our Indigenous legal orders are going forward when we're sharing Indigenous education in a place where we need to meet curriculum outcomes. So just keep that in mind. So the first thing that I want to talk about is basically who we are and who we've been since before Canada was created. So before Canada has ever existed, before any settlers had arrived on our land, on our continent, we were our own country. We were our own nation. We were our own powerful entity. And even today, that nationhood is recognized by the United Nations. It's recognized by global international powers that where countries meet. And so what that means is that us as a people, for me as a Cree person, we are called the Nehiawak. And before colonization, these are all of the things that we practiced on an everyday basis. These are all of the things that we've had. And so the first thing that we've had was land. So anything that you see, if you're in the country of Canada, if you're in the country of the United States, if you're in these places on Turtle Island, all of that land, even in the cities, you might not think that it's your land when you're in the city, but through our oral history and through our own understanding, this was all Indian land. This was all Indigenous land, everywhere you look in Canada. And you have to remember that even if you feel out of place in certain areas, you need to know that that land actually belongs to you. It belongs to your ancestors, to your people. And another one is language. Nehiawak, in the Cree language, a nation will also have language. And so we all have our own sacred languages. Unfortunately, a lot of them aren't being passed down to the younger people, but over time, as we do more lessons like this, hopefully one day our Cree language and every other language for that matter will be revitalized in some way. We had our own governing systems. We had strict traditional governing structures, and they were often very complex, and they were based on, they mimicked a position on nature. They organically worked around how nature works, how animals respect one another, and that's how our traditional governing structures were positioned around the environment, for the protection of the environment, for the protection of all life. And so we had treaties with other nations. So if you ever hear of like the United States when they make treaties with other countries, that's exactly what our people did with other nations before colonization. We had our own economy. We had our own trading networks. We had our own systems in order to ensure that everybody in our community was playing a significant role for the betterment of our people. We had our own education systems, and that was also based on nature, based on living off the land. It was based on oral history, and we had our own culture and ceremonies. Well, these are all things that we still have. We still have these things. I'm going to get to that at the end of my lesson. However, I wanted to highlight this and just say that it's our understanding that we've been here since time immemorial. And what that means is that since the beginning of time, our people have been here. Since the beginning of time, our people have had all of these things and have always practiced all of these things. Our peoples have never not been a nation. We've never not had land. We've had all of these things since time immemorial, and that means since forever. So first off, I wanted to highlight two things. So how was Canada created? Well, we all know the story of Pocahontas. We all know, we have a kind of an idea, a fantasy of what it was like when the first settlers arrived to Turtle Island. And how it happened in the first place is that right here, we have these gentlemen, and they're holding a sword and a flag. And what had happened was, in the 1400s, the Pope had issued a papal bull. And a papal bull is like a doctrine where the law is saying that they're making a new law. And these laws are meant to be followed by the people. They're meant to be enforced. And it really, this is where the rule of law comes into question for Canada, because a lot of when you read any kind of legal document, when it comes to Canada, it's always by the title of the underlying title of the crown. The underlying title of the crown. That's where Canada derives its authority. That's where they get their power to create laws, to make laws. And so in the 1400s, the Pope had issued a papal bull called, we usually refer to it as the Doctrine of Discovery, or and what had happened was they had used this claim in order to say that the land was empty, that if the land was empty, if there was no Christians, if there was no Christian believers in God, then that meant that these were not human beings, and that this land was open for the taking. That if you found land where Indigenous peoples were, they did not believe in God, so they could not own land. So that's the legal justification, and that's very important. At one point in my life, I met with the Minister of Justice, who was Jody Wilson-Raybould, and what had happened was I had questioned her on that. I said, one day, do you think that the Doctrine of Discovery would ever be repealed? Do you think that Canada would ever say that it was wrong to claim our land because we weren't Christians. And the Minister of Justice was actually an Indigenous woman, and she unfortunately didn't have a response for me. And we were sitting in a meeting at a table across from one another with the AFN, and she retorted that the doctrine of discovery was already rescinded, it was already repealed, and that it's void, that the doctrine of discovery doesn't matter anymore. But I don't necessarily believe that, because the legal justification of why Canada was created, actually it all stems from that doctrine. It all stems from the idea that Indians cannot own land because they are not Christian. And so that is the first moment in time that I can see where Canada had did something that was legal, but it wasn't necessarily good. The next part is while they were claiming our land, while they were claiming it through the doctrine of discovery, years later, the Royal Proclamation had been issued. And so what this Royal Proclamation means is that in the United Kingdom, where the Crown had lived, they were ready to let go of one of their dominions. And so one of their settlements was in Canada. And this is actually how Canada was created, was where the United Kingdom had agreed to create it legal through law, where Canada would eventually become its own country, and it would no longer belong to the United Kingdom, directly governed by the Queen. They would have their own governments. It enacted Parliament in order to oversee the ability to make laws. So when the Royal Proclamation was created, there was a big problem that they had in their way. And what this problem was the millions and millions of people that were on these lands. And if you don't remember, on our last slide, a few slides back, our people, we had used the land, we had our own languages, our own laws, we had our own government, our own healthcare system, our own education system, all of these different systems, and they're very complex, and we were living on the land, we were using the land, and there was no way of avoiding us. And so over time, the government, Canada had this idea that Indian people had become a real problem. We had become a problem to their progress and what they envisioned and what they wanted to create as a country. So they began making policies, and all of these were in fact legal. They weren't necessarily good things, but these were all policies that were created by the Canadian government in order to solve this problem that they saw. And so one of those things is they started to sell our lands. They started to, they would encourage farmers and pioneers to expand into the West where Indigenous peoples were already settled. And they would encourage them to start farming there and to start cultivating and keep pushing west all the way into the mountains. They keep pushing and pushing and pushing to try and take all of our land. Another thing that's really important to identify, especially today, is the Indian Act. So what this means is that in 1876, this is the same year that we signed treaty, that this document was issued and this was legal. And what it had done was it actually began to control our people in every aspect of our lives. It began to control our government. So our traditional governing structures that we had in place are no longer in place because of this document, and a chief and council system was now implemented. And unfortunately, a lot of our people, we don't have the same connection. We don't have a connection anymore to our traditional governing structures. A lot of us don't even know what that would look like. There are traditional governing structures with the Haudenosaunee and the Six Nations. There's traditional governing structures in British Columbia. They're all over the place, but it's unfortunately it's kind of hard to find them nowadays. So the Indian Act had controlled every aspect of our lives, and it still does today. So they took over control of all of these things that made us or makes us a nation. So the Indian Act had designated us to reserves. When we were put in Indian residential schools, we could no longer speak our language. Instead of our own laws, following the Creator's laws, our natural laws, we now have bylaws, and we have constitutions that we can implement on our reserves. So again, they implemented a chief and council system. So no longer our traditional governing structures, no more clan mothers, no more Mahjani Sak, no more warrior societies. They took over our education in Indian residential schools, and they banned our culture and our ceremonies. So we need to really ask ourselves as to why the Indian Act was created and why it's even upheld today, if it essentially destroys who we are as a people. And so another important part to highlight in this lesson I found was that one of the biggest impact on our people, I believe, that has ever happened since Canada was created and began creating these laws. And keep in mind that all of this was legal by the Canadian government and under their authority of the underlying title of the Crown. So Indian residential schools, in order to educate the Indian, in order to assimilate us into the public, the Canadian public today, all of our children are Indigenous children across the country. There was over 150,000 children that had attended Indian residential schools, over 6,000 confirmed deaths. You were more likely to survive, oh, there's a typo there. You were more likely to survive World War II as a foot soldier than you were to survive an Indian residential school as a child. The last school closed in 1996. I was born in 1994, so I would have been 2 years old when the last Indian residential school closed. And so this is all information from the Truth and Reconciliation final report. And these are the four most important points that I find in my classrooms when I'm teaching, that if you don't remember anything about the period of Indian residential schools, and if you have a conversation with somebody and they make it seem like it wasn't a big deal, or that you're overreacting, or that it was such a long time ago, for those of you listening at home, I want you to remember those 4 points, and I don't want you to ever forget them, because these are the most vital, most important things that I find when it comes to the subject of Indian residential schools and solving the Indian problem, was that these 4 parts of it had made such a significant impact on our people, and essentially destroyed a lot of who we are as people. However, there's still a lot for us to be able to resurge and to bring back for our people. And so this Think Indigenous page is one way of doing that, is offering our side of the story. It's offering our teachings and who we are as Indigenous peoples, because what they did in these schools was they wanted to create us to make us like white people in order to live in Canadian society. But the more that we practice our ceremonies, the more that we learn our languages, the more that we operate from our own education systems, that's oral history, the more that we live off the land, the more that we learn about treaties, the more that we learn about the Creator's laws. That's how we reverse this policy, reverse this attempt to destroy our people. And so for those of you listening at home, especially if there's young people, know that every time you grow your hair long and you're able to proudly wear your braids, remember those things, because you're practicing who you are as an Indigenous person, and you're showing the world that that you weren't destroyed in these schools, that your spirit has overcome all of these problems that had happened in our schools. So look at this one. If you are more likely to survive World War II as a foot soldier than a child at these schools, like there are very terrible and horrible things that had happened in these schools. My mom is a residential school survivor, and I know firsthand about the intergenerational effects. That means that what happens after the generation is impacted, after all of those people are hurt and impacted, it then goes down to the children, and it carries on until people are able to break the cycle. So I'm hoping that somebody watching here will maybe feel inspired to break that cycle. So today, Canadian law or policy is often derived usually by the Prime Minister of Canada. So you all know the Prime Minister is Justin Trudeau. However, the Prime Minister has cabinet ministers that he utilizes in order to carry out laws, in order to make laws, in order to enforce them. And two of those people today, the first is the Honourable Minister Carolyn Bennett. So she is the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations Canada. And we have Minister Mark Miller. And so Minister Mark Miller is the Minister of Indigenous Services. So when I was growing up, all of this system was right here. It was just Indian Affairs. And so if you ever hear people talking about INAC, it was Indian and Northern Affairs Canada, INAC. That's what we used to refer to it as. However, today, in response to one of our reports, the RCAP report, the federal government had split this department into two. And one part of the department is Crown Relations. So Minister Bennett is in charge of things like treaties, self-governance, all of those kinds of agreements on a nation-to-nation basis. And we have Minister Mark Miller in charge of Indigenous Services. So he's in charge of handling things like child welfare. He's in charge of ensuring that Indigenous programming in Canada has the funds that it needs in order to help our people. And before I go any further, I want you to know that I'm not attacking either of these people. I worked with Minister Bennett for a few years, and she's a very, very good woman. She's a very good-hearted and kind woman, and she loves her job, and she has a lot of passion for our people. However, there is a major problem that we find in bureaucracy in the Canadian government, where we aren't able to effectively solve the problems that we need to. We aren't effectively to do the things that we need to do, because Canada is still an extreme colonial entity that is hell-bent on assimilating Indigenous peoples. And what that means is, if you go back to this picture, this is what we call assimilation. And what that means is that a long time ago, we didn't dress in these fancy clothes that we do today. We didn't talk the way that we do today. We used to speak our languages and operate as our own country, as our own people. And this is what we need to protect. This is what we need to remember and restore as our people. And so, unfortunately, today, the Canadian government, they still operate from that same law and policy. They still operate, we're still under this policy called the Indian Act. And what that does, again, it implements a reserve system, and it gives the authority of these two ministers to create these laws and to, they say who is able to get the funding needed in order to operate. So they do have to lobby the finance minister. And what I'm talking about is that all of these systems here, when it comes to Indigenous peoples, are extremely underfunded. And that's one of the biggest problems that we face as Indigenous peoples today, is the extreme underfunding in government. And I've actually worked with Minister Bennett where we had tried to lobby the finance minister in Canada in order to receive more funding, in order to prevent the government from discriminating against Indigenous peoples, especially like kids in care. The Human Rights Tribunal in Canada, so this entity that oversees human rights in this country, has actually found that our government discriminates against Indigenous children, especially in foster care. But we can't forget all of these different systems that are implemented and extremely underfunded, and therefore discriminating against our people. And this is all legal. This is all Canadian law. It's all policy, and it's all a part. Okay, so we need to keep in mind that the reserve system that we see today, it's not our system. It's the system of the government. We need to keep in mind that the healthcare system that we see today, it's extremely, it's heavily criticized for being institutionally racist. It's a very systemically racist healthcare system that we have today, and it's inadequate to deal with the problems that we have. The justice system, our peoples are most likely to be incarcerated. Even Gladue reports, there are reports in order to solve that problem of the over-incarceration rates, but there's places like Saskatchewan today that don't even implement Gladue reports. The child welfare system, our chief and council system, we have membership codes. So all of these systems are legal and administered by the government of Canada, and it has led to all of this. So when you see that our people are in poverty, or that we're poor, or that we don't have money, just remember that poverty is imposed. It's imposed because we are detrimentally underfunded in every single system of department of government. And more we're going to find human rights cases against Canada for discriminating against our people, especially our children. So we need to remember that poverty has become imposed upon our people. So our chief and councils operate on a crisis management basis. So unfortunately, our chief and councils, the way that they govern, the way that they operate, is that they're continuously underfunded every single year. And when that happens, the only thing that they have the power to do is to react when tragedy happens in their community. The only thing that they can do is manage all of the crises that are happening in reserves because of this failed system. So again, every single one of these parts or systems are detrimentally underfunded. There's mass systemic racism across our country, and and what I'm referring to is that when we look at the poverty of Indigenous peoples, at the corruption in our band offices and chief and council, or all of the problems, the homelessness, the incarceration rates, child welfare, when we look at all of these problems, a lot of Canadians believe it's Indigenous peoples, it's inherently our problem, that it's inherently who we are to be poor. It's inherently who we are to battle alcoholism or drug addictions and stuff like that. But Canada has never accepted responsibility for all of these systems. Canada has never accepted full responsibility and told Canadians that that it is their fault. It is their problem that they are imposing poverty on our people, that they are continuously underfunding our people, that we are still controlled by the Indian Act, and all of this is legal. All of this has been manufactured back to the doctrine of discovery, back to the claim of our lands. And so we need to remember how systemic racism is used in this country in order to create a mass blanket of ignorance, where Canadians no longer, they can't see the truth. They can't see what's happening behind the scenes with the federal government of Canada when it comes to imposing poverty upon our people. And one day, Canada needs to be held accountable for their racist citizens. So our governance models are extremely poor, and what that means, it's not taking a shot or being it's not taking a shot or a jab at chief and councils, because a lot of them are very good people. However, unfortunately, they're operating under very poor models, and so what that means is that they are still operating under Canadian policy that was made to assimilate our people. It was made to, in many cases, to destroy our people and to keep us into poverty. So one day, hopefully in my lifetime, we see that these chief and council systems are able to evolve. They're able to evolve, and they're able to go back to our traditional governing structures and systems in order to truly revitalize and resurge our nationhood, and where we can exercise who we are as a people. So I want you to remember all of the unfortunate Canadian laws that have happened to our people, all of the legal things that had been committed against our people. So this was all under the rule of law. And so the rule of law is a fundamental principle of Canadian democracy. And so a lot of people today, especially today, considering the Wet'suwet'en blockades, they will argue that the rule of law is, it needs to be enforced, it needs to be equal, it needs to be the same for everybody. But as I just taught you, as I just showed you, it hasn't been the same for Indigenous peoples. The rule of law has been a tool used to destroy our people, and that's essentially why I myself had come to law school now, hopefully to be able to identify all of those barriers and all of those problems within the legal system, and somehow advocate for our people to achieve a better life in this country. And so keep in mind that the rule of law, or the laws that Canada makes today, just because they are legal doesn't mean that they are good. And the same way goes both ways. If something is illegal, it doesn't mean that it's bad. And what it does mean is that Canada, it has an agenda. This government has an agenda, and it always has. Since the Doctrine of Discovery, since the Royal Proclamation, since the Indian Act, since Indian residential schools, this agenda is still going forward, and it's still operating. And it's up to our people, it's up to you young people, to be able to educate yourselves, to be able to learn the history, the real history of this country, and to learn who we are as Indigenous peoples, to learn about the Creator's laws, to learn about our ceremonies, our culture, our languages, and to build a relationship with our land, because that's the only way we are going to it's the only way we are going to move forward as a people, is that we have to remember our land, our languages, our laws, our government, our treaties, our economy, our education, our culture, and ceremonies. And over time, we will see small changes in society in order to move forward as a people, because we were all still recovering from the harm that was caused by Indian residential schools. But over time, I'm confident that we will revitalize all of these things, and we'll be able to live as a stronger and happier people along our treaty partners with the Crown and the settlers that had come from it. And so that's my lesson for today. If you guys have any questions, feel free to message the page. You can inbox me. My name's André Bear on my Facebook page too. I will most likely be doing another lesson. Just let me know what kind of topic you would like to hear, and I will provide another lesson plan in order to meet our outcomes. So thank you. Hi.